Let's discuss this now with Lee Jones. He's a reader of international politics at Queen Mary University in London and joins me now there from the English capital. Lee, thank you so much for your time and coming onto the program. Now, Myanmar is Southeast Asia's poorest nation, and that poverty has only been exacerbated by what we've seen happen since February, by the junta, by their crackdown on dissent. It's also been difficult to even get information coming out of that country. But do we have an idea of what life is like for ordinary people right now in Myanmar?
There is a great deal across the country. So in some parts of the country, there is active armed resistance to the military, particularly in the ethnic minority areas. So several armed groups have ramped up their attacks on the military. And also there have been People's Defence Forces formed to fight the military. And they've been directed by the National Unitary Government, which is the MPs that were elected last year, and they've come together to form a sort of shadow government. They've told the People's Defence Forces to escalate their attacks on the military. So in some areas, it's incredibly unstable and dangerous. And people have been caught up in the conflict, and the number of internally displaced persons, as well as refugees, as your report just said, have gone through the roof. I think in the main urban areas, the scenes that we saw earlier this year, immediately after the coup in the first couple of months, where there was mass mobilization and there were a general strike and lots of civil servants were participating in the civil defense, the civil disobedience movement, that has petered out, and life is returning more to normal, but it's still very abnormal. Lots of people, for example, have to queue to try and get cash out of cash machines. There's a massive shortage of cash. There are shortages of daily necessities like food. And so life is really not back to normal, but it does depend on where you are living as to how you're experiencing Myanmar's intersecting catastrophe.
You talk about this intersecting catastrophe and also about the NDP and the shadow government that they had formed. And earlier in the year, after the coup, we saw Myanmar's ambassador to the UN refuse to step down. He was very vocal in what was happening in his country. He was actually meant to speak at the UN General Assembly today, I believe. We're now hearing that that's not going to happen. Is there any sense that he's bowing to any pressure, or is he expected to stand firm in his beliefs?
Well, essentially what you have with Myanmar at the United Nations is two rival governments presenting rival credentials. So the military has sent its representative and says, this is the ambassador of Myanmar. And the National Unity Government, composed mostly of National League for Democracy MPs, says the old ambassador who sided with them is Myanmar's ambassador. So the question is, which government is the United Nations essentially going to recognize? So there's a big crisis over who will be allowed to represent Myanmar at the United Nations.
Which is going to be very interesting to see what happens with that. And speaking about the international reaction to that coup in Myanmar, after it happened, there were Western sanctions on the junta. The ASEAN leadership came together to discuss the situation. Do you think they've done enough to try and help the people of Myanmar?
To be honest, I think there's very little that the outside world can really do to leverage the military. They're very well resourced. They have control over major parts of the economy, but they're not dependent on relationships with Western economies. So Western sanctions will not tend to hurt the military, but they will hurt other parts of the economy. For example, the garment sector, which is mostly privately owned and employs a lot of people. That's what my research on sanctions has shown in the past, that sanctions hurt the wrong people in Myanmar. And so Western states have been very reluctant to impose wide-ranging sanctions this time. The Chinese have more leverage, but at the same time, they don't control what happens on the ground in Myanmar. They didn't really want this coup. They're not very happy with it. They'd like a restoration of democracy, some kind of electoral rule and stability across their border, because it's bad for business and it's bad for events along the border. As for ASEAN, they can try to mediate in the crisis, but the problem is that they can only mediate if both sides will allow them to. The military has been very slow to accept a special envoy from ASEAN. Basically, they want to restore what they call stability, basically crush the opposition, and then they'll accept an envoy in. And the opposition doesn't want to talk to ASEAN at all because ASEAN is, they see it as recognising the military coup to engage in any dialogue. So you have an incredibly polarised situation on the ground, where, as your reporter said, one side is holding up practically all of the guns. The opposition side is quite weak and fragmented, difficult to see how they can actually overcome the military. And in that situation, for foreign interventions to yield any positive outcomes is an incredibly tall order.
An incredibly tall order indeed. Lee Jones, great to speak to you and get your insight on what's happening in Myanmar. Thank you so much.